questions, very much influenced by this type of theory. But I don't think people who are illiberal can understand the shock in liberal intellectual elitist circles of a man like Heidegger joining the Nazi Party. It's actually slightly emotionally difficult to describe it. It is, from the sort of view of BBC sort of culture, it is the worst thing, and not just the worst thing, but the beyond the worst that one could do. This man of supreme intellectual gifts, dwelling alone in his Shavian hut in the woods, dwelling on the ontology of death in life, in death in life, in death in life, you see what I mean? Joins what they consider to be a sort of barbarous wrecking crew. And they're appalled. They're utterly morally appalled. And since the war, people have not really known what to do with Heidegger at all. And because, in a sense, his theory is an attempt to bring back a different version of the West civilization, most people who were on the side politically that he associated with, albeit for a period, don't really know how to make use of him either, in a strange sort of way. That's why he's this sort of elicible figure. It's noticeable in Tomislav Sunik's book on the New Right, for instance. Heidegger, in a way, can't be integrated. It's a sort of cigarette on the paper that burns through to the other side. He really is in a zone on his own. And what's he trying to do? He's trying to see whether human beings can live authentically. There's a moment in Nietzsche's letters early on in his theoretical course, development, prognosis, after the first text, Birth of Tragedy, when he describes seeing a goat herd killing a goat on a hill. I think it's in Italy. And it's what James Joyce would call an epiphany. It's a moment of total, in his terms, authentication and realization. It's a poetic moment. It's what certain natures call a perfect moment. A moment that certain consciousnesses will look at before they die as the one moment that was perfect. The sky and the goat and the man and the soil and the sun. And it's essentially, it's a religious moment. It's a sort of cosmotheist moment in a way. And Heidegger's point is to get people to experience such moments, which is why he writes this enormous theory to try and intellectually prepare people for the possibility of having such moments. Which is why, of course, when people try and stimulate themselves to have such moments, they chant, they sing, they starve themselves, they go without, they live ascetically, they do things to alter consciousness. In a sense, he just deals with pure consciousness, because he doesn't almost relate to the physical level at all. But it is an attempt to go back to what many Western and Indo-European theorists have believed was cardinal at the beginning of Greek culture. It's Nietzsche's view and it's other people's view of the Greek tragedians, the great three, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, that there is a quote-unquote decadence, that in a sense Aeschylus is the most hieratic, the most removed from everyday, the most transcendental, the most ascending. Sophocles is not a humanist playwright by any means. This is the man who wrote the Theban plays, of course. But it's a step down from that sense of mystery, that sense of sort of sheer awe. We now live in a society without any sense of the sacred at all, as de Beaumont has pointed out. It's virtually void. And a level down in this trajectory involving the Greek tragic writers is Euripides. He's hardly writing soap opera, but where the gods and the goddesses are seen almost, if not level with human beings, then as superhumans who are just a couple of levels up, but they relate to each other, they fight with each other, they make love to each other and all this sort of thing, in a way which is recognisably human-esque. And in a way, if you could metaphoricise it, because with theory like this, that's all you really can do, certainly in a talk of this nature, those prior moments when Aeschylus looks at the divine, because don't forget Western theatre begins with religious ritual and gradually separates itself out. It begins with a monologue. And then Aeschylus has the idea that this is going on a bit too long, so we'll split it. We'll have a duologue and the two consciousnesses talk to each other. And in that you have the tension with which you can sustain drama in our culture, in any culture. Now, in this theatricalisation of this meeting in the hut in the woods where he wrote Being and Time, and where he wrote other books on Greek tragedy and on Nietzsche. Celan and Heidegger have this talk, and this is banal dreaming, but this type of theory is actually quite close to forms of artistic creation, to forms of higher, non-entertainment based spiritual creation in art forms. And Celan says, why did you join the Nazi Party? And Heidegger replies, because they were the one movement of the 20th century that in my terms had a tragic view of life. That had a view of life which is actually the motif and the inner essence, Dasein, of the Greek tragedians taken up to date 2,500 years later. And I think that's essentially a truthful statement. He gave an interview to the Spiegel magazine after his death, in the sense that it was recorded before his death, but could only be published as part of his will and settlement after his demise. I think it was published about 3-4 weeks after he died. In which case, and they asked him, because it was a very adversarial interview while he was alive, post-dated as I say, about why he joined, why he did this, why he did that, and so on. And in actual fact, there's lots of evasion and attempts at explication and bringing in all the usual things. And even though political correctness wasn't a buzzword then, he's in some ways playing games. He's responding. He's like a politician on the defensive. But in actual fact, as often with art, in my view, you can cut to the truth suddenly through all sorts of layers. Even if the person never said it, it can actually illuminate, because it crystallises in a form the value of something. And when he says to Celan, with no one there in this fantasy, because Celan didn't go and see him in that hut for nothing, just so he could put his name in Heidegger's signature book. I've been up to the professor's lodge. You know, it's not... No, people at this sort of level don't do those sorts of things. He wanted to know why, as George Steiner said, one of, if not the most advanced theoretical mind of the Western civilization in the 20th century adopted this particular course. And he did it because he believed that you cannot have a society where death has no meaning, because life has no meaning. And you cannot have a society which bases itself upon the absence of the religious urge, however you define that urge and whatever system you use. Because if you do the reverse, you will end up with a society which has two values beyond subsistence. And that could be seen in the title of a grubby play produced in London a couple of years ago called Shopping and Fornication. Yeah. That is all that life is if you do not have spiritual levels based upon that. People will always be completely divided about the forms and the language that they use to talk about cardinal matters, but in a way, in a quite moving way really, Heidegger is attempting to get people to face, in early modernity, what it means to have a civilization and not to be human, but to live with profound and real meaning. There's no doubt that this theoretical postulation and this extreme abstraction is quite alien to elements of the Western civilization, certainly our own quadrant of it during the last couple of 100 years. But it is an attempt to place, not to aestheticize life, but to place life ultimately at the service of God, even and most especially for people who either don't believe in him or can only approach such numinence through endless tiers of theory. Thank you very much.
Have we any questions? I don't know how...
Questions?
I've noticed that leftists systematically, completely misunderstand what Heidegger meant by nihilism.
Yes.
In his conversations with Ernst Jünger, I think it was, he talks about